Farm Karen demanded access to my hayfield for community parking, so I had her SUV hauled off my property twice. Hi everyone. Before I dive into this ridiculous saga, you should know I'm not someone who goes looking for confrontation. I'm a third-generation farmer who spends dawn to dusk working our family's 80 acres, and the last thing I need is to waste precious daylight dealing with entitled nonsense. Unfortunately, entitled nonsense found me anyway in the form of my neighbor Diane, the self-appointed social director of the new luxury subdivision that sprouted up next to my eastern property line 3 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me paint the picture of my farm for you. We're located about 20 minutes outside of Riverview, in what used to be entirely agricultural land. My grandparents purchased this property in 1952, and it's been in our family ever since. We primarily grow organic vegetables for local restaurants and farmers markets, along with maintaining apple orchards and some hayfields. The main farmhouse sits about half a mile back from the county road, with a long gravel driveway leading to it. For decades, our closest neighbors were other farms, the Johnsons with their dairy operation to the north, and the elderly Miller couple who kept horses to the west. But about 5 years ago, old man Eastman sold his 40 acres to developers who squeezed 25 luxury country estates onto what was once soybean fields. They named it Harvest Meadows, though nothing has been harvested there except the money from city folks wanting to experience country living without actually being in the country. Most of the new residents keep to themselves or are actually quite friendly. Several families bring their kids over during apple season, and I've made arrangements with a few neighbors who wanted to learn about growing their own vegetables. I've never had an issue with sharing knowledge, or even occasionally letting trusted neighbors walk the trails through our north woods. But Diane Prescott was different from the moment she moved in. I first met her during last year's summer solstice, when she organized what she called a neighborhood harmony festival in the subdivision's community park. She invited surrounding property owners, including me, with a handwritten invitation requesting representation from the local agricultural community to enhance our connection to the land. I thought it might be good to establish positive relations, so I brought some early season produce to share. Within 10 minutes of arriving, Diane cornered me with a glass of wine in hand. "You know, all that land you have sitting empty could be put to much better use," she said, gesturing vaguely toward my eastern hayfield. "Our community really needs overflow parking for our events. The developer only planned for single-family vehicles. Not entertaining. I explained that what she called empty land was actually a productive hayfield in its fallow rotation." She waved her hand dismissively. "But you only use it occasionally. Couldn't you just let us park there for our summer gatherings? Maybe create a little gravel lot in the corner closest to our development?" I politely but firmly declined, explaining that agricultural land isn't meant for vehicle parking, that it would compact the soil, potentially leak automotive fluids, and disrupt the ecosystem we've carefully maintained. She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language, then simply said, "Well, think about it. It would really benefit the community." I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A few weeks later, I was inspecting irrigation lines in the back section of the property when I noticed something odd in the hayfield. Tire tracks cutting through the young growth, leading from the direction of Harvest Meadows. Following them, I discovered a crude path had been flattened through my field, connecting to a gap in the fence line that separated our properties. At first, I wondered if teenagers had taken a joyride, but the tracks suggested multiple vehicles. I repaired the fence, posted no trespassing signs, and again thought that would resolve things. Then came the weekend of the Harvest Meadows Summer Bash. I returned from the Saturday farmers market to find 6 cars parked neatly in my field, with more turning in from a makeshift entrance where someone had deliberately cut my fence again. A string of festive lanterns had even been hung along the new parking area. I was livid, but managed to keep my composure as I walked over to the community park where music was blaring. There was Diane, directing people where to park, on my property. When she saw me approaching, she smiled as if she was doing me a favor. "There he is, our farming neighbor. Isn't this working out wonderfully? Now our guests don't have to park all along the county road." "Diane," I said, keeping my voice level, "those cars are parked on private property. My property. You've cut my fence, created an unauthorized access point, and are essentially trespassing." Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, don't be so territorial. It's just for today, and that field was just sitting empty anyway. We're being very careful not to damage anything. Except the fence you cut, the hay you've flattened, and the clear property boundaries you've ignored," I replied. "I need those cars off my land immediately." That's when her smile transformed into something harder. "You know, this attitude isn't very neighborly. We're trying to build a community here, and you're sitting on acres of unused space. Would it really hurt you to share?" I realized then that reasonable discussion wasn't going to work. Diane didn't see my farm as a working agricultural operation. To her, it was just scenery for her subdivision lifestyle, resources to be used for her convenience. "The cars need to be moved within the hour, or I'll have them towed at the owner's expense," I stated clearly, "and the fence needs to be properly repaired by tomorrow." Her face flushed red. "You wouldn't dare. These are your neighbors. Where are people supposed to park? That's not my problem to solve. Your development should have planned better parking. My land is not your overflow lot." As I walked away, I heard her calling after me, something about working together and community solutions. But I'd had enough. Little did I know this was just the opening act in what would become an increasingly absurd power struggle over my own property. I returned to the farmhouse and immediately called Wilson Towing, a local company I've used before when equipment needed hauling. I explained the situation, and thankfully, Tom Wilson understood completely. Having grown up in farming communities, he had little patience for property rights violations. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he assured me. "Just point out which vehicles need moving." While waiting, I grabbed my camera and walked back to document the damage to my fence and field. The makeshift entrance they'd created was about 12 feet wide, with fence posts completely removed rather than just cut. Someone had put actual effort into this invasion. I photographed everything. The damaged fence, the flattened hay, the tire tracks cutting through the field, and of course the row of vehicles now parked as if my land were a designated lot. I noticed several people glancing my way from the community party, including Diane, who was now huddled with a few other residents, gesturing animatedly in my direction. I ignored them and continued documenting the damage. Tom arrived right on schedule, his large tow truck rumbling down the county road before turning onto my property through the proper entrance, my driveway. I walked over to meet him by the vehicles. "These 6, I confirmed, pointing to the row of cars. "They were all brought in through that cut fence over there." Tom nodded and got to work, starting with a large white SUV that I'd seen Diane driving around town. I figured that might send the clearest message. Just as he was hooking it up, Diane came storming across the field, followed by a man in a golf shirt who I assumed was her husband. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the field. "You can't tow our cars." I remained calm. "Actually, I can. These vehicles are trespassing on posted private property. I gave fair warning to have them removed, and that warning wasn't heeded." "This is outrageous," the man with her stepped forward. "I'm Richard Prescott, HOA president of Harvest Meadows. Surely we can work something out like reasonable people." "I tried reasonable," I replied. "I explained that this is not a parking lot, but a working hayfield. My fence was deliberately cut to create unauthorized access to my property. That's not reasonable. That's trespassing and property damage. By now, several party guests had wandered over, concern evident as they watched Tom secure the SUV for towing. "Where is he taking my car?" Diane demanded. "Wilson's towing yard on Route 16, I answered. "They accept cash, credit, or debit for the towing fee and daily storage." The reality of the situation finally seemed to sink in for some of the car owners, who quickly broke away to move their vehicles. Within minutes, 4 of the 6 cars had backed carefully through the makeshift entrance and disappeared back into the subdivision. That left just Diane's SUV, already secured to the tow truck, and a red sedan whose owner wasn't immediately present. Richard tried a different approach. "Look, we apologize about the fence. That was clearly inappropriate, and we'll have it fixed immediately. If you'll just allow Tom to unhook Diane's vehicle, we can put this unfortunate incident behind us." I considered this for a moment. Part of me wanted to be neighborly and de-escalate the situation. But another part, the part that had watched my explicit boundaries being ignored, knew that without consequences, this problem would only repeat itself. "The fence will need professional repair by a licensed contractor," I stated. "And I'll need written acknowledgement from your HOA that my field is not to be used for parking under any circumstances, now or in the future." Diane scoffed loudly. "This is extortion. You're holding my car hostage." "No, ma'am," Tom interjected, having remained professionally quiet until now. "I'm removing a vehicle that's trespassing on private property at the owner's request. Standard procedure. We're not signing anything," Richard declared. "And if you go through with this, you can expect to hear from our attorney." I shrugged. "That's your choice. In the meantime, you might want to find the owner of that red sedan before it gets towed too." Richard pulled out his phone and hurried back toward the party while Diane stayed, arms crossed, watching as Tom finished securing her vehicle. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, voice low and threatening. "My brother-in-law is Judge Prescott. This little power trip of yours is going to cost you." I'd heard enough. "Tom, we're good to go." As Tom pulled away with Diane's SUV in tow, she followed on foot, still shouting threats about lawyers and judges. The owner of the red sedan, a flustered-looking young woman, came running across the field just as Tom was leaving. "Is he taking cars? Is my car next?" she asked, panicked. "If you move it now, you'll be fine," I assured her. She nodded gratefully and hurried to her vehicle. Unlike Diane, some people could recognize when they were in the wrong. As the last car cleared my property, I surveyed the damage. The hay in this section was effectively ruined for this cutting. The fence would need professional repair. But most concerning was the clear disregard these new neighbors had shown for basic property rights. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I walked the perimeter of my property that bordered harvest meadows, checking for any other breaches. Finding none, I returned to the farmhouse and wrote down everything that had happened while it was fresh in my mind. Something told me this wasn't over, that Diane wouldn't let this humiliation stand without retaliation. I was right. The very next morning, I found a formal letter from the Harvest Meadows Homeowners Association in my mailbox, claiming that my agricultural activities were causing undue disturbance to residential comfort, and requesting that I modify farming operations to accommodate community standards. The battle lines had been drawn, and apparently we were just getting started. I stared at the HOA letter in disbelief. The audacity was breathtaking. According to this document, my excessive early morning equipment operation, noxious organic fertilizer application, and unsightly agricultural storage were violating their community standards. They were essentially asking me to stop farming on my farm. I immediately called my cousin Ellie, who practices agricultural law in the county seat. After explaining the situation and reading her the letter, she laughed. They do realize your farm predates their development by about 70 years, right? Agricultural zoning supersedes residential complaints in this county, especially when the farm was established first. Apparently that doesn't matter to them, I replied. What should I do? Forward me the letter. I'll draft a response, reminding them of the Right to Farm Act that protects established agricultural operations from nuisance complaints by newer residential developments. And I'll make it clear that any further harassment could result in legal action from our side. I felt better after talking with Ellie, but I was still uneasy. Legal protection was one thing. Having hostile neighbors was another. I decided to document everything meticulously going forward. I installed trail cameras at key points along the property line and ordered no trespassing signs to place every 50 feet along the fence bordering Harvest Meadows. The fence repair company came out that afternoon and quoted me $200 to properly restore the damaged section. I authorized the work and asked for detailed documentation of the damage for potential legal or insurance purposes. They seemed used to such requests and took plenty of before and after photos. While they worked, I drove to the county recorder's office to pull the official plat maps showing the exact property boundaries. I also filed an incident report with the sheriff's department about the trespassing and property damage, not pressing charges yet, but establishing an official record. When I returned home, I found another surprise waiting for me. A different letter, this one taped to my mailbox, written in flowing handwriting on floral stationery. To the farmer next door, it has come to my attention that you're unwilling to cooperate with our community's reasonable requests. Perhaps you don't understand that times have changed. Your outdated farming practices are diminishing our property values and quality of life. The Harvest Meadows Community Committee has unanimously voted to pursue all available options to ensure our residents' comfort. This includes petitioning the county to reassess local zoning regulations and organizing community pressure to encourage more neighborly behavior. Additionally, your aggressive action of having cars towed from unused land shows a disturbing lack of community spirit. Consider this a final opportunity to demonstrate goodwill by allowing limited community access to your undeveloped areas. We await your positive response. Diane Prescott, Community Relations Director, Harvest Meadows Estates. I photographed the letter before removing it, adding it to my growing file of documentation. The phrase undeveloped areas particularly bothered me, as if land that wasn't covered in houses was somehow vacant or unused. That evening, I called a meeting with my two farmhands, Miguel and Trevor, to alert them to the situation. Both had worked with me for years and were practically family, so now we have to worry about fancy subdivision people trying to tell us how to farm? Miguel asked incredulously. My father faced the same thing when developers built near his orchard in California. It never ends well. We're not changing how we operate, I assured them. But keep your eyes open for trespassers or suspicious activity, and document anything unusual. Trevor nodded. I saw a couple people walking along our north field yesterday, taking pictures. Thought they might be bird watchers, but maybe not. This was concerning. The north field was far from the subdivision boundary and not easily accessible unless someone was deliberately exploring my property. If you see anyone on our land without permission, approach them politely but firmly. Remind them they're on private property and ask them to leave. If they refuse, don't engage further. Just call me. After they left, I sat on my porch watching the sunset over the western fields, something my grandfather used to do every evening. He would have been furious at these intrusions, but probably would have handled them with more grace than I could muster right now. I tried to channel his patient wisdom as I considered my next steps. The following morning, I woke at my usual 5:30 a.m. to start chores. As I stepped outside, coffee in hand, I noticed something odd in the newly repaired fence. Section flyers, at least a dozen of them, had been zip-tied to the fence posts overnight. Even from a distance, I could see they were printed on bright orange paper. Walking closer, I felt my blood pressure rise as I read the headline, "Community Notice. Toxic agricultural chemicals in use. Health hazard to residents and pets." Beneath. This alarming headline was a crude map showing harvest meadows and my farm, with ominous skull and crossbones symbols scattered across my fields. The text claimed I was using restricted pesticides that were known to cause respiratory issues, skin irritation, and possible long-term health effects. This wasn't just annoying anymore. This was defamation that could seriously impact my certified organic operation. Someone had crossed a dangerous line. I tore down every flyer, carefully placing them in a plastic storage bag to preserve as evidence. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. False claims about chemical use could devastate my organic certification, which had taken years to establish and required annual inspections and rigorous documentation. My farm had been chemical-free for over a decade. We used natural pest management, companion planting, and organic compost, practices I was proud of and that local restaurants specifically sought out. These flyers weren't just annoying, they were a direct attack on my livelihood. I immediately called Ellie again, this time sending her photos of the flyers before I'd even finished my morning coffee. "This crosses into legal territory," she said firmly after reviewing the images. "This is defamation per se, false statements that can harm your business reputation. Document where and when you found these, and check if any have been posted in public spaces beyond your property." Following her advice, I drove around the neighborhood and found more flyers posted on community bulletin boards at the local grocery store and coffee shop. I spoke with the managers, explaining the situation and the false information being spread. Both were regular customers at my farm stand and immediately removed the flyers, looking troubled by the allegations. When I returned home, I found Trevor walking the property line with his phone camera. "Found something you should see, boss," he said, leading me to the irrigation pond at the southeastern corner of the property, the part closest to harvest meadows. There, floating near the edge, were dozens of lawn chemicals bags and containers, Roundup, synthetic fertilizers, and various pest control products. Products we would never use on our organic farm. "Someone's trying to stage evidence," I said, feeling sick to my stomach. "Don't touch anything." I called the sheriff's department immediately, explaining the escalating situation and the apparent attempt to contaminate or frame my farm. Deputy Collins arrived within the hour, photographing the planted evidence and taking my statement. "This looks deliberate," he agreed, carefully documenting the scene. "The products are all still sealed, so no actual contamination occurred, but the intent is concerning." As Deputy Collins was finishing his report, a small convoy of 3 vehicles pulled into my driveway. I recognized Diane's husband, Richard, in the lead car, accompanied by 2 men in suits I didn't recognize. Behind them was a white van with Channel 8 News emblazoned on the side, and bringing up the rear was Diane herself in a rental car. "Perfect timing," I muttered to Deputy Collins. "I think we're about to meet our suspects." The deputy nodded. "I'll stay for this. Might save us all some time." Richard approached first, looking surprised to see law enforcement already on scene. "We've come to address the serious environmental concerns affecting our community," he announced, as if reading from a prepared statement. "Mr. Prescott," I replied, "I was just filing a report about vandalism, trespassing, and attempted contamination of my certified organic farm. Would you happen to know anything about these chemical containers that mysteriously appeared in my irrigation pond this morning?" His expression faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "We've received multiple reports of chemical drift and runoff from your operation. We've brought County Environmental Inspector Davis and our HOA attorney to conduct an assessment." The news van's side door slid open, and a reporter and cameraman emerged, already filming. Deputy Collins stepped forward. "This is private property and an active investigation scene. Unless you have a warrant or the owner's permission, you need to remain at the boundary." The man Richard had identified as an environmental inspector looked uncomfortable. "I was called to investigate alleged chemical contamination from agricultural runoff. I wasn't informed there was already law enforcement involved." "There's no official county inspection scheduled," Deputy Collins stated, checking with dispatch through his radio. "If you'd like to file a formal request through proper channels, that's your right, but ambush inspections aren't standard procedure." The cameraman had been filming our exchange, but lowered his equipment when the deputy turned toward him. "Sir, are you aware that in this state, recording someone on private property without consent could constitute invasion of privacy?" The reporter intervened. "We're covering a story about toxic agricultural chemicals threatening a residential community. We received a press release this morning with documented evidence." I felt a surge of anger, but kept my voice steady. "That evidence is fabricated. I run a certified organic operation with annual inspections and complete transparency. What you're covering is a harassment campaign against a farm that's been here for generations, by a subdivision that moved in 3 years ago." Diane, who had been hanging back, finally stepped forward. "We have witness testimony about illegal chemical use and nighttime spraying operations. We have photographs of containers right there in your pond. Containers that someone placed there." "This morning," Deputy Collins interjected. "Based on their condition and placement, they appear to have been deliberately staged. We're treating this as vandalism and potential criminal mischief." Richard paled visibly. "We had nothing to do with any containers. We're simply responding to community concerns." The environmental inspector, looking increasingly uncomfortable, addressed me directly. "I apologize for the confusion. I was told this was an official county response to multiple complaints, but I see now that's not the case. I'd be happy to schedule a proper inspection at your convenience, though based on your organic certification, I doubt we'd find any issues." The news crew, sensing the story wasn't what they'd been promised, began packing up their equipment. The reporter pulled Diane aside, and though I couldn't hear their conversation, Diane's gesticulating and the reporter's skeptical expression suggested things weren't going her way. "I suggest everyone return to their vehicles," Deputy Collins said firmly. "This is a working farm and private property. Any further trespassing or harassment could result in criminal charges." As the unexpected visitors reluctantly retreated, I noticed Miguel standing by the barn entrance, recording everything on his phone. Smart man. After everyone left, Deputy Collins finished his report and advised me to consider getting a restraining order if the harassment continued. "Document everything," he emphasized. "Timestamps, photos, witnesses, and consider more security cameras, ones that cover the pond and other vulnerable areas." I nodded, already mentally calculating the cost of an expanded security system. It wasn't an expense I'd planned for, but it seemed necessary now. "I'll file this report as attempted vandalism and possibly criminal mischief," he continued. "If we can prove who planted those containers, they'll face charges." After the deputy left, I called a local security company that had installed systems for several farms in the area after equipment theft had become a problem. They promised to send someone out the next day to assess the property and recommend appropriate coverage. That evening, Ellie called with news. "I've drafted a cease and desist letter addressing the defamatory flyers, trespassing and harassment. I've also contacted the Organic Certification Board to alert them to the situation, so they're aware someone might be trying to sabotage your standing." "Thanks, Ellie. I appreciate you moving so quickly on this." "One more thing," she added. "I did some research on harvest meadows. Their development plan originally included a community event space with designated overflow parking, but it was never built. The developer cut corners to maximize house lots and apparently promised amenities they never delivered. This information put things in a new light. So their parking problem isn't really about my field, it's about their developer breaking promises. Exactly. But rather than holding the developer accountable, they're trying to appropriate your land as a solution. Classic displacement of responsibility. After we hung up, I sat on the porch considering this new information. The evening was peaceful, frogs singing from the pond, fireflies beginning to flicker across the fields. It seemed surreal that such tranquility could exist alongside such petty conflicts. My contemplation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle coming up the driveway. I tensed, wondering if Diane or Richard was making another unwelcome appearance, but instead recognized the familiar truck belonging to Frank Johnson, my northern neighbor who ran the dairy farm. Frank was in his 60s, a second-generation farmer, like me, and had always been a source of practical wisdom. He climbed out of his truck with a thermos and 2 cups. "Thought you might need this," he said, pouring steaming coffee and handing me a cup. "News travels fast. Heard you've got subdivision trouble." I filled him in on the events of the past few days as we sat watching the sunset. He listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "Same playbook, different decade," he finally said. "When the first subdivision went in near Dad's south pasture in the 80s, we dealt with similar nonsense. Complaints about cow smell, demands to move fences, kids trespassing and getting hurt, then parents threatening lawsuits. How did you handle it? Documentation, clear boundaries, and absolute consistency. Never gave an inch of ground, because with those types, compromise is seen as weakness." He took a sip of coffee. "But we also invited the reasonable neighbors to farm days, showed them what we did, why we did it, educated their kids, turned some of them into allies." "You think that would work with Harvest Meadows?" Frank shrugged. "Not with your Diane character. Some people are just entitled to the core. But there must be reasonable folks in that subdivision who moved there because they actually appreciate rural character. Find them." His advice made sense. Fighting Diane and her supporters would be necessary, but building alliances within the subdivision could change the dynamic altogether. The next morning, I was checking the irrigation system when Miguel drove up on the ATV, looking agitated. "You need to see this," he said, handing me his phone. On screen was the Harvest Meadows community Facebook page, which someone had apparently invited Miguel to join. A new post from Diane featured photos of my farm with red circles highlighting unsightly agricultural equipment and visual pollution. But what caught my attention was her announcement of a community meeting scheduled for that evening to discuss legal options for addressing the adjacent nuisance property. The comments section was illuminating. While some residents echoed Diane's complaints, many others expressed confusion or outright disagreement. "I moved here because it's next to a working farm. That's the whole appeal of country living," wrote one resident. "Has anyone actually experienced any problems from the farm? Because my kids love watching the tractors, and my property value has only increased," commented another. "Is this about the parking issue from the summer party? Because trespassing on someone's land isn't cool regardless of who owns it," noted a third. Not everyone in Harvest Meadows was aligned with Diane's crusade. Frank's advice about finding allies suddenly seemed more promising. "What are you going to do?" Miguel asked. I handed his phone back, a plan already forming. "I'm going to attend their meeting." I decided not to go alone. I called Ellie, who agreed to accompany me in her professional capacity. I also contacted Deputy Collins to inform him of the meeting, not requesting his presence, but ensuring he was aware of the escalating situation. "I'd like to document this meeting," he said. "Given the pattern of behavior, it would be helpful to have an official record if things progress to criminal harassment. By 6:45 that evening, Ellie and I were parked outside the Harvest Meadows Community Center, a modest building adjacent to their neighborhood pool. Cars filled the small lot, suggesting a larger turnout than I'd anticipated. "Remember," Ellie advised, as we approached the entrance, "stay calm no matter what. We're here to correct misinformation and establish legal boundaries, not to engage in arguments." Inside, about 40 residents had gathered on folding chairs. A small platform at the front held a table where Diane, Richard, and 3 others sat importantly. A projector displayed a slideshow titled "Protecting Our Community: Legal Options for Agricultural Nuisance." Heads turned as we entered, whispers spreading through the room. Diane's eyes widened, then narrowed when she spotted us. She leaned over to whisper urgently to Richard, who glanced our way with visible discomfort. We took seats in the back row, and I noticed Deputy Collins slip in shortly after, taking a position near the wall where he could observe. He nodded slightly in acknowledgement, but maintained a professional distance. Richard called the meeting to order, his voice lacking conviction. "Welcome, everyone. As you know, we've gathered to discuss options regarding the challenges presented by the adjacent agricultural property." "You mean the farm that was here 70 years before our houses?" called out an older man near the front, prompting scattered laughter. Richard cleared his throat. "Yes, well, we recognize the historical context, but as property values and community standards evolve—" "Can we cut to the chase?" interrupted Diane, clearly impatient. "We've distributed information about the chemical usage and visual nuisances from this property. We've experienced firsthand the uncooperative attitude when requesting reasonable community accommodations for parking. Tonight, we'll be discussing potential legal actions, including zoning challenges, nuisance lawsuits, and petition options to the county commissioners." A middle-aged woman raised her hand. "I've lived here for 2 years, and I've never experienced any problems with the farm. In fact, my children love visiting their farm stand. What exactly are the documented issues we're discussing?" Diane clicked to a slide showing close-up photos of farm equipment, compost piles, and the irrigation pond. Visual pollution affecting property values, noise from early morning operations, potential chemical drift. "I'm sorry," I interrupted, standing. "I feel I should address these accusations directly since they concern my property." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. "For those who don't know me, I'm the owner of Heritage Oak Farm. My family has worked this land since 1952, long before Harvest Meadows existed. I need to correct several pieces of misinformation being shared tonight." I walked toward the front, feeling surprisingly calm. "First, regarding chemicals. My farm has been certified organic for 12 years. We use no synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, a fact verified by annual third-party inspections. I produced my certification documents and handed them to the woman who had asked the question. The flyers distributed about toxic chemicals constitute defamation, as they make false claims that could damage my business. Similarly, the containers placed in my irrigation pond yesterday were staged, as documented by the Sheriff's Department." I nodded toward Deputy Collins. Richard shifted uncomfortably. "We had nothing to do with any containers." "Second," I continued, "regarding property values. Farms like mine are precisely why developments like Harvest Meadows market themselves as country living. Your own sales materials feature photos of my sunflower fields and apple orchards. My farm enhances rather than detracts from your property values." Several residents nodded in agreement. "Finally, regarding parking, my private property is not available for subdivision overflow. The issue of inadequate parking should be directed at your developer, who promised but never delivered a community event space with additional parking." This revelation caused a stir, with several residents turning to look accusingly at Richard, who had been on the original development committee. I'm not here to create conflict, I concluded. I've peacefully coexisted with neighbors for decades. I welcome respectful relationships with all of you. What I cannot accept is harassment, trespassing, or defamation. As I returned to my seat, Ellie stood. For the record, I'm Eleanor Martinez, agricultural law specialist. I've advised my client to document all instances of harassment and property damage. The cease and desist letters regarding defamatory materials have been delivered. To the HOA board, any continuing actions along these lines could result in legal consequences for individuals or the HOA as an entity. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Several residents looked embarrassed. Others appeared angry, though whether at me or their HOA leadership wasn't clear. An elderly gentleman in a veteran's cap stood up. I've heard enough. I didn't move next to a farm to then complain about living next to a farm. That's absurd. And I certainly didn't authorize my HOA dues to be used for some vendetta against a business that's been here longer than any of us. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. Diane's face had flushed a deep red, while Richard looked increasingly uncomfortable. A young mother stood next. I'd like to propose we form a neighborhood committee focused on positive farm relations instead of this adversarial approach. My kids would love to learn more about organic farming, and I bet others would too. The meeting was slipping rapidly out of Diane's control. Diane shot to her feet, attempting to regain control. This meeting isn't about forming friendship clubs with the farm. We're discussing serious property value and quality of life issues. The young mother looked taken aback by Diane's harsh tone, and several other residents frowned. An older man in a plaid shirt raised his hand. I'd like to know exactly who complained about chemical drift. I've lived on the edge of the subdivision closest to the farm for 3 years and have never experienced anything like that. We've had multiple reports, Diane insisted, though she didn't elaborate. From whom specifically, the man pressed. Richard intervened. We're not at liberty to disclose individual complaints due to privacy concerns. Convenient, someone muttered. Loudly enough for everyone to hear, a woman in her 40s stood up. I'm Lisa Bennett. I teach environmental science at the high school. I actually use heritage oak as an example of sustainable farming practices in my curriculum. My students take field trips there every spring. The idea that they're using harmful chemicals is simply false, and I'm troubled that our HOA is spreading this misinformation. Diane's face grew increasingly flushed. The concerns go beyond just chemicals. There's noise pollution, visual blight from equipment, and the owner's refusal to work with us on community needs. You mean the owner's refusal to let us park on their private property? Called out someone from the back. That's not a community need. That's trespassing. The meeting was rapidly descending into chaos, with multiple conversations breaking out across the room. Richard tapped his gavel ineffectually, while Diane looked like she might explode. Deputy Collins chose this moment to step forward. Folks, if I might add some perspective here, in the past 3 days, we've received reports of criminal trespass, vandalism, and potentially fraudulent claims regarding the farm in question. I'd strongly advise everyone to be thoughtful about escalating neighborhood disputes into legal territory. This sobering statement temporarily quieted the room. Taking advantage of the pause, Ellie addressed the crowd. I understand that moving to a rural area comes with certain expectations about the surroundings. However, farms are working businesses with legal protections under the Right to Farm Act. This isn't about being unneighborly. It's about respecting legal boundaries and livelihoods. Richard nodded, seemingly relieved to have a way to de-escalate. Perhaps we should table further discussion until we can research these legal protections more thoroughly. In the meantime, this is ridiculous, Diane interrupted, slamming her hand on the table. We're letting ourselves be intimidated by legal threats when we should be standing together as a community. If we all joined in a class action suit, Class action suit for what, Diane? It was the veteran who had spoken earlier. For a farm doing exactly what farms do? I didn't sign up for that nonsense, and I doubt anyone else here did either. Several people nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable, but remained silent. Richard cleared his throat. I think we need to reconsider our approach. Perhaps a smaller committee could research the issues more thoroughly and report back, "We don't need more research." Diane's voice had risen to a near shout. "We need action. And if none of you have the spine to protect your property values, I'll handle it myself." With that declaration, she gathered her papers and stormed from the room, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. After a moment, Richard tried to salvage the meeting. "I apologize for the intensity of tonight's discussion. I think we should adjourn for now and revisit these matters at our next regular HOA meeting." As the residents began to disperse, several approached me directly. The environmental science teacher invited me to speak to her class. A retired couple asked about volunteering opportunities. The young mother who'd proposed the neighborhood committee exchanged contact information. Not everyone was friendly. A few gave me cold looks or whispered among themselves, but it was clear that Diane's united front against the farm was largely illusory. Walking back to the car with Ellie, I felt cautiously optimistic. That went better than expected. "Yes and no," Ellie replied. "You've got allies in the community now, which is good. But Diane's parting words concern me. People who feel cornered and publicly humiliated can become unpredictable. Deputy Collins joined us in the parking lot. I'd increase your security measures sooner rather than later," he advised. "That woman strikes me as someone who doesn't back down easily." I nodded, watching as residents dispersed to their homes. I was hoping this would resolve things, but I have a feeling we're just getting started. The next morning proved me right. I woke to find that overnight someone had spray-painted "Selfish Farmer" in bright red letters across my main barn door. I stared at the vandalism in disbelief, my stomach knotting with anger and disappointment. The red paint was still tacky. This had happened only hours ago. I immediately called Deputy Collins, who arrived within 30 minutes to document the damage. "This is escalating from harassment to criminal vandalism," he said, photographing the graffiti from multiple angles. "Between this and the other incidents, we have grounds for a more serious investigation." While waiting for him, I'd reviewed the security camera footage I had installed. Unfortunately, the main barn wasn't yet covered by the new system, and the existing cameras didn't capture the perpetrator clearly. Just a hooded figure approaching in the darkness around 2 a.m. "Could be anyone," Deputy Collins acknowledged, studying the grainy footage. "But given recent events, we have a pretty obvious suspect pool." After he left, promising to increase patrols near my property, I called a local painter who specialized in barn restoration. The sooner I removed the graffiti, the better, not only for my own peace of mind, but to prevent any satisfaction the vandal might get from seeing their handiwork. While I waited for the painter, I decided to continue with my regular farm activities. I refused to let harassment disrupt the operation I'd worked so hard to build. There were CSA boxes to prepare for weekly subscribers, irrigation to check after yesterday's spotty rainfall, and tomatoes to harvest for tomorrow's restaurant deliveries. Miguel arrived at his usual time, his expression darkening when he saw the vandalized barn. "This is getting serious, boss. I know. The sheriff's department is involved now, but we can't let it stop us from doing our work." By noon, the painter had covered the graffiti with a fresh coat of the original red paint, erasing all evidence of the vandalism. As he was finishing up, a silver sedan I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A woman in her 50s stepped out, looking slightly nervous as she approached. "Hello," she called, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you the owner? I'm Barbara Reynolds from Harvest Meadows." I nodded cautiously, wiping my hands on a rag. "That's me. What can I do for you, Mrs. Reynolds? I wanted to apologize for what happened at the meeting last night," and she glanced at the freshly painted barn door. "For whatever else has been going on. A lot of us in the neighborhood are embarrassed by how things have escalated." Her sincerity seemed genuine, so I invited her to sit at the picnic table near the farm stand, where we sometimes hosted outdoor lunches for workers. "I've lived here 3 years," she continued once we were seated. "My husband and I chose Harvest Meadows specifically because it bordered working farmland. We wanted that connection to where food comes from." "I appreciate that perspective," I said. "Unfortunately, not everyone seems to share it," Barbara sighed. "Diane has been difficult since she became Community Relations Director. She tends to appoint herself spokesperson for problems nobody else is actually complaining about. The parking issue is real. The developer promised amenities they never delivered, but targeting your farm isn't the solution. I understand having inadequate parking is frustrating, but that's not something I created or can solve by giving up productive farmland. Of course not, most of us recognize that. After you left last night, several of us stayed to discuss forming that positive relations committee that was suggested. We'd like to find ways to support the farm rather than fight it." This was an unexpected but welcome development. "What did you have in mind?" "We thought perhaps we could organize farm tour days for residents, maybe establish a farm-to-neighborhood direct buying program. Some residents have even suggested creating a community garden space within our development for those interested in growing their own food, with your guidance, of course." These were constructive ideas that could benefit both communities. I'd be open to all of those suggestions. "I've always believed farms should be connected to the communities they feed," Barbara smiled. "That's wonderful. There's one more thing, a bit more delicate." She hesitated. After Diane's outburst last night, Richard called an emergency board meeting this morning. There was a vote of no confidence, and she's been removed as Community Relations Director. The position will remain vacant until the next regular election. This was significant news, though I was careful not to show too much satisfaction. "I hope that helps calm things down." "We hope so too, but—" Barbara glanced around nervously. Diane didn't take it well. There was quite a scene at the meeting, with threats of lawsuits against the HOA itself. "I just thought you should know she might be even more volatile." Now, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. "Judge denied Diane Prescott's emergency injunction request against your farm. She filed yesterday claiming imminent health hazards. Court found no evidence to support claims. Call me." I showed Barbara the message. She shook her head in disbelief. "She filed an injunction without even HOA support. She's completely out of control." "Apparently so," I replied, feeling both relief at the judicial outcome and concern about what Diane might do next. Barbara stood to leave. "I should get going, but I wanted you to know that you have allies in Harvest Meadows. Not everyone supports this vendetta." As she drove away, I felt cautiously optimistic. The community wasn't monolithic in its opposition to my farm. In fact, it seemed Diane represented an increasingly isolated minority position. Still, as Deputy Collins had warned, people who feel cornered can become unpredictable, and Diane Prescott had just lost on multiple fronts. The next few days passed without incident. The security company completed installation of additional cameras covering all vulnerable areas of the property, including motion-activated lights near the barn and pond. I met with Ellie to review the case documentation thus far, and she seemed satisfied with our legal position if further action became necessary. I was beginning to hope the worst was behind us. The Positive Relations Committee from Harvest Meadows had emailed a thoughtful proposal for community engagement activities. and I'd scheduled a farm tour for interested residents the following weekend. Several local restaurants had reached out, after hearing about the situation, expressing support for my organic operation and increasing their orders. Then came Thursday morning. I was in the greenhouse checking seedlings when Trevor burst in, breathless from running. "You need to come now. Eastfield, someone's there with construction equipment." I dropped my clipboard and ran for the ATV, Trevor jumping on behind me. As we sped toward the eastern property line, bordering harvest meadows, I could hear the unmistakable sound of heavy machinery, cresting the small rise that separated the greenhouse area from the hayfield. I saw it. A yellow bulldozer was cutting a wide path through my field, heading directly from the subdivision boundary toward the main farm road. Behind it stood Diane Prescott, arms crossed triumphantly, alongside a confused-looking man in a construction vest. I slammed the ATV to a stop and jumped off, heart pounding with a mix of shock and fury. "Oh, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted over the bulldozer's engine. The operator, noticing my arrival, immediately shut down the machine. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. Diane stepped forward, a document in her hand, establishing the community access road as per county easement regulations. "What easement? There is no easement on this property." She thrust the paper toward me. "Historical right-of-way easement established 1927, predates your family's ownership. The county has confirmed we have the right to restore this access point." I snatched the document and quickly scanned it. It appeared to be some sort of official-looking county document with a stamp and signature, referencing a historical access route across what was now my property. "This is the first I'm hearing of any easement, and I've owned this land for over 15 years. You can't just start bulldozing without notice or verification." The construction worker looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said to Diane, "you assured me all notifications had been delivered and the landowner was aware of the work order." "He was notified," Diane insisted. "If he chose to ignore it, that's his problem." I took a deep breath, struggling to maintain composure. "I received no notification whatsoever, and I guarantee my lawyer would have mentioned any legit easement claim during our property research." I turned to the bulldozer operator. "I'm formally requesting you stop work immediately until this can be verified. You're currently trespassing and causing significant property damage." The man nodded, clearly relieved to have a reason to pause. "I'll need to call my supervisor. This isn't standard procedure." Diane stepped between us. "You have a contract to complete this access road. If you stop now, we'll pursue breach of contract claims. And if he continues," I countered, "he'll be named in the criminal trespassing and property damage charges I'm about to file. Your choice." The operator pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my boss. This needs clarification." While he stepped away to make his call, Trevor had been examining the document in my hand. He leaned in and whispered, "Look at the county clerk's signature. Compare it to the other legal documents we have." I looked more closely and realized he was right. The signature didn't match the style of our property tax documents or other county paperwork. Even the county stamp looked slightly off. "This document is forged," I said, loud enough for both Diane and the operator to hear. "I'm calling the sheriff right now, and I suggest you," I pointed to the operator, "contact your legal department immediately." The color drained from Diane's face, but she maintained her defiant posture. "You're bluffing. The easement is registered with the county." "Then you won't mind waiting here while we verify that with the sheriff's department, will you?" I pulled out my phone and called Deputy Collins directly, briefly explaining the situation. He promised to be there within 15 minutes and advised me to document everything while waiting. Trevor had already started taking photos and video of the damage, a 50-foot-long, 12-foot-wide path of destroyed hayfield, the bulldozer sitting in the middle of my property, and Diane standing near the property line. The construction supervisor arrived before the sheriff, a harried-looking man in a company polo shirt. After reviewing the situation and examining the document, he immediately ordered his employee to secure the bulldozer and leave it in place, pending official resolution. "We'll be conducting our own investigation into how this work order was processed," he told me apologetically. "This is not how we operate." Diane stood off to the side, still projecting confidence, but now making calls of her own, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Deputy Collins arrived with another officer. After surveying the scene and examining the document, he shook his head. "Ma'am," he addressed Diane, "I'm going to need you to accompany us to the station to answer some questions about this document and how you obtained it." "This is harassment," she protested. "I'm exercising a legal right to access. The county clerk has confirmed by phone that this document is not authentic," Deputy Collins interrupted. "Falsifying county documents is a serious offense. We can do this cooperatively or formally, but you will be answering questions today." For a moment, I thought Diane might actually try to flee. Her eyes darted toward her car, parked at the subdivision boundary, and she took a half-step backward before apparently thinking better of it. Deputy Collins must have noticed too, because he subtly positioned himself to block any potential escape route. "This is a misunderstanding," Diane insisted, her voice higher than usual. "I was given this document by a county clerk. If there's an issue with its authenticity, I'm as much a victim as anyone." Deputy Collins remained professionally neutral. "We'll sort that out at the station. For now, I need you to come with us voluntarily, or we can escalate this to a formal detention." Diane glared at me as if this were somehow my fault, then reluctantly agreed to accompany the officers. As they led her to the patrol car, I overheard her making frantic calls, first to Richard, then apparently to her brother-in-law. The judge, neither of whom seemed to be answering. After they departed, the construction supervisor approached me, looking deeply apologetic. "I want to assure you, sir, that our company will take full responsibility for restoring the damaged area. We should have verified the easement documentation more thoroughly before beginning work." I appreciated his professionalism. "I understand. You were misled. My main concern now is getting the field back to its original condition as quickly as possible." He nodded. "We'll bring in environmental remediation specialists to assess the proper restoration process for agricultural land. In the meantime, I'll need to leave the equipment here until we get clearance from the sheriff's department, but I'll make sure it's secured." Once everyone had left, I surveyed the destruction with Trevor. The bulldozer had carved a swath through prime hayfield, destroying not just the current growth but potentially altering the soil composition and drainage patterns. "What do you think she was trying to accomplish?" Trevor asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "Creating a direct access road from the subdivision to our main farm road," I replied. "Once established, it would have been much harder to close it down. Classic adverse possession tactic. Create access, use it regularly, then claim it as an established right-of-way." Trevor whistled low. "That's some dedicated spite right there. Risking criminal charges just to force access to your property." I nodded grimly. Some people simply can't accept being told no. Back at the farmhouse, I called Ellie to update her on the latest development. She was stunned. "Document forgery is several levels beyond harassment," she said. "That's potentially a felony depending on how the prosecutor decides to charge it. Did they take her into custody?" "Voluntarily for questioning, but it looked pretty serious. Deputy Collins confirmed with the county clerk that the document isn't authentic." "This could be the break we need to end this whole situation," Ellie said thoughtfully. "Criminal charges tend to focus people's attention wonderfully. Even if her brother-in-law is a judge, forgery isn't something that can be easily dismissed." After hanging up, I sat on the porch with a much-needed cup of coffee, trying to process the morning's events. The farm had been my sanctuary, my livelihood, and my legacy. Seeing it deliberately damaged stirred a deep anger I rarely experienced. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. Warily, I answered. "Is this the owner of Heritage Oak Farm?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, it is. Who am I speaking with?" "This is Andrea Prescott, Judge Prescott's wife and Diane's sister-in-law. I'd like to speak with you about what happened today." I tensed, expecting more threats or accusations. "I'm listening." "I want to apologize," she said, surprising me completely. "What Diane did was inexcusable, and our family does not condone it. My husband has recused himself from any involvement in this case for obvious reasons, but we wanted you to know that we aren't supporting her actions." The sincerity in her voice seemed genuine. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Prescott. Diane has been—" She hesitated, searching for words, "struggling with some personal issues lately. That's not an excuse, just context. We've been encouraging her to seek help, but after today's events, we're going to be more insistent. I understand personal struggles, but this has gone well beyond neighborly disagreements into criminal territory," I said, keeping my tone respectful but firm. "You're absolutely right," she agreed, "and she needs to face the consequences of her actions. We just wanted you to know that her behavior doesn't represent our family's values or the values of most Harvest Meadows residents." After we ended the call, I felt slightly reassured that at least the judge wouldn't be using his influence to protect Diane from appropriate consequences. Still, the damage, both physical and emotional, had been done. Late that afternoon, Richard Prescott himself appeared at my door, looking haggard and embarrassed. "I came to apologize in person," he said without preamble. "I had no idea Diane was planning anything like this. She's been increasingly difficult to reason with about this farm situation." I gestured for him to sit on the porch swing. Hasn't she been released?" he nodded. "On her own recognizance for now, but they've confiscated her passport. The county prosecutor is reviewing the case for potential charges." "And where do you stand in all this, Richard? You've been supporting her." "Actions until now." Richard shifted uncomfortably on the porch swing. "I've been trying to maintain community harmony. When Diane first raised concerns about parking, it seemed like a reasonable discussion to have, but things spiraled quickly, and I failed to recognize how fixated she was becoming. Fixated enough to forge county documents and bulldoze my field, I noted. He winced. "Yes, it's indefensible. The HOA board has officially distanced itself from her actions and voted to cover any restoration costs as a gesture of goodwill. We're also implementing new bylaws to prevent any single board member from claiming to represent the entire community without proper authorization." This was a significant concession, but I remained cautious. What about the ongoing harassment? The flyers, the fake chemical allegations, the vandalism? "We have no evidence connecting Diane directly to the vandalism," Richard said carefully, "though I personally have my suspicions. As for the flyers and chemical claims, those were clearly her initiatives, and the board has issued a formal retraction to all residents. We're also sending corrective information to local businesses where the flyers were posted." His willingness to take concrete actions was encouraging, but questions remained. Why was she so obsessed with accessing my property? The parking issue doesn't explain the level of determination she's shown. Richard hesitated, then sighed deeply. "This stays between us?" I nodded, curious. Before moving to Harvest Meadows, Diane was deeply involved in real estate development. Her former company specialized in acquiring agricultural properties and converting them to residential developments. She saw your farm as an opportunity. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. She wanted access to devalue my property for eventual acquisition. "I believe so," Richard admitted. "When you resisted the initial parking requests, it became personal for her. She's not accustomed to being denied." This new information transformed my understanding of the conflict. This wasn't just about parking or neighborhood disputes. It was a calculated attempt to undermine my farm's viability for potential development. "Does Does she have financial connections to developers still? I asked. Her brother runs Prescott Development Group. They've been looking to expand in this area. Richard looked genuinely ashamed. I should have recognized the pattern sooner, but she presented everything as community advocacy. After Richard left, I called Ellie again to share this revelation. She wasn't surprised. It fits the profile perfectly, she said. Create problems. For the landowner, document nuisances to neighbors. Establish unwanted easements, then swoop in with an offer when the property becomes too problematic to maintain. Classic developer tactics when targeting agricultural land. What should we do with this information? Documentation, as always. It establishes motive for her actions, which strengthens both the criminal case and any civil action we might pursue. I'll update our files. The next morning brought another visitor, Barbara Reynolds from the neighborhood committee, accompanied by Lisa Bennett, the environmental science teacher. We've drafted a formal letter of apology from residents, Barbara explained, handing me an envelope. Over 70 households have signed it. We want you to know that Diane's views and actions are emphatically not shared by most of us. Lisa added, we've also created an educational pamphlet about the value of organic farming to circulate in the community. Many newer residents simply don't understand agricultural practices or why they're important to preserve. Their initiative was touching. Thank you. This means a lot. There's one more thing, Barbara said. The HOA emergency meeting last night was quite revealing. Several residents came forward with stories of Diane's intimidation tactics over various issues, from paint colors to landscaping choices. It seems her campaign against your farm was just the most extreme example of a pattern. The board voted to ban her from serving in any official capacity again, Lisa continued. And there's talk of pursuing a restraining order to keep her from representing herself as a community spokesperson. This internal reckoning within Harvest Meadows suggested the community was serious about resolving the conflict. Still, I remained cautious. Diane had proven herself determined and resourceful, and I doubted she would simply accept defeat. My caution proved warranted that same afternoon when Trevor spotted Diane's rental car slowly driving past the property, the driver clearly photographing the farm buildings. Want me to follow her? Trevor asked. No, just document it. Note the time, direction, and what she appeared to be photographing. I had just finished a call with the environmental remediation team assessing the bulldozed field when Deputy Collins arrived with unexpected news. We've connected the vandalism case to your ongoing situation, he said. A neighbor's security camera caught footage of someone matching Diane Prescott's description approaching your property the night the barn was vandalized. It's not conclusive ID, but it's enough for a search warrant for paint evidence. You think you can prove she did it? If she still has the clothing she wore, or the paint cans, possibly. The footage shows the suspect in a light-colored jacket that would likely have paint transfer. These cases often break when physical evidence connects to video evidence. This was a significant development. While the document forgery was serious, adding criminal vandalism charges would compound the legal consequences she faced. There's something else you should know, Deputy Collins added. We've received reports that Ms. Prescott has been attempting to contact other farmers in the area with similar boundary issues to yours. It appears she may be trying to establish a pattern of unreasonable agricultural practices to support some larger claim. This revelation sent a chill through me. She's building a case against multiple farms? That sounds like more than personal vendetta. That's strategic. Deputy Collins nodded. Frank Johnson mentioned she'd approached him with questions about county agricultural regulations and whether he'd ever had complaints from Harvest Meadows residents. She claimed to be conducting a community impact survey. Frank didn't fall for it, I hope. Said he showed her the door pretty quick. He's been around long enough to recognize trouble, but she might have had better luck with newer or less established operations. After Deputy Collins left, I immediately called Frank to get the full story. The veteran dairy farmer confirmed Diane had visited him unannounced, clipboard in hand, asking pointed questions about his manure management, equipment noise levels, and whether he'd consider reasonable accommodations for neighboring developments. "I've dealt with developer types before," Frank said gruffly. "They start with surveys and community concerns. Then suddenly you're facing zoning challenges and nuisance lawsuits designed to make selling out the only viable option. Have you heard if she's approached anyone else?" "Called the Millers and the Jacobsons after she left. Sure enough, she'd been to both places with the same routine. Neither gave her anything useful." I thanked Frank for the warning and hung up, my mind racing. If Diane was building a coordinated case against multiple agricultural operations, this went beyond personal spite into something potentially more damaging to the entire farming community. That evening, I hosted an impromptu meeting at my kitchen table with Frank, the Millers, and the Jacobsons. All were multi-generational farmers facing increasing pressure from development. "She's gathering ammunition," Ellen Miller stated flatly, "looking for any practice she can frame as a nuisance to build a case for rezoning or regulatory changes." Bob Jacobson nodded. "Classic developer playbook. My cousin lost his orchard in Virginia this way. Death by 1,000 cuts. Complaint after complaint until the legal fees and restrictions made continuing impossible. And then they swoop in with an offer just high enough to tempt desperate farmers but well below true market value," Frank added. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We can't just wait for her to escalate." Ellen, who served on the county agricultural board, had a suggestion. "We go on offense. I'm calling an emergency session of the Ag Board to discuss strengthening our right to farm ordinances. We highlight the economic impact of farms in the county, the cultural heritage, the food security aspects. And we get ahead of her narrative," Bob added. "Community outreach, farm tours, educational events. Make sure county residents understand what's at stake if farms start disappearing." Frank, pragmatic as always, brought us back to immediate concerns. "That's all good long-term, but we need to deal with Diane Prescott directly. She's facing criminal charges, but that won't necessarily stop her campaign." We agreed on a multi-pronged approach. Document all contact from Diane or her associates. Coordinate our responses to any complaints or allegations. Support the county's case against her where possible, and begin a proactive community education initiative. As everyone was leaving, Frank pulled me aside. "There's something that's been bothering me. How did Diane get that bulldozer company to show up without verified paperwork? Most legitimate operators wouldn't take that kind of risk." It was a good question. "You think there's more to the story?" Frank shrugged. "Just seems odd. Might be worth asking that construction supervisor if there was pressure from somewhere else. Maybe her developer brother?" The next morning, I called the construction company and asked to speak with the supervisor who had been on site. He was initially hesitant to share details, but opened up when I explained the broader pattern we were discovering. "The work order came through our Special Projects Division," he admitted. "It had executive authorization, which typically means it's been approved at the highest levels. That's why it bypassed some of our normal verification procedures. And who exactly provided that executive authorization?" There was a long pause. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but given the circumstances, the authorization came from Gregory Prescott, CEO of Prescott Development Group. He's apparently related to the woman who was on site. This confirmed our suspicions about Diane's connections and motivations. The question now was how high this went and how many resources they were willing to commit to their apparent land acquisition strategy." I shared this information with Ellie, who was even more concerned than I expected. "Prescott's Development Group isn't just some local operation," she explained. "They're a regional powerhouse with significant political connections. If they've targeted this area for development, they'll have resources and influence that go well beyond what Diane could muster on her own." So what are we facing here? Potentially a coordinated strategy to convert agricultural land to high-end residential development. Diane's personal grudge against you might have accelerated their timeline or made her methods more extreme, but I suspect she's working within a larger plan. The implications were sobering. This wasn't just about parking rights or neighborly disputes anymore. It was about the future of farming in our entire community and possibly the county as a whole. The next day, I received an unexpected call from Richard Prescott. "I need to meet with you urgently," he said, his voice tense. "Not at your farm, somewhere public." His unusual request raised immediate red flags, but my curiosity won out. The diner on Highway 16, 30 minutes. When I arrived, Richard was already seated in a back booth, nervously checking his phone. He looked up as I approached, relief washing over his face. "Thank you for coming," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "I've discovered something you need to know." Richard glanced around before continuing in a lowered voice. "After Diane's arrest, I started going through our home office papers. I found documents relating to Prescott Development Group, specifically a targeted acquisition strategy for this area." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were maps of the county with agricultural properties highlighted, including mine, Frank's, and several others. What caught my attention was a document titled Phase 1, Community Integration and Resistance. Assessment. "This is dated before you even moved to Harvest Meadows," I noted, skimming the contents. Richard nodded grimly. "Diane and her brother planned this years ago. The subdivision was just the first phase. Get established in the community, identify potential obstacles to expansion, and develop strategies to overcome them. You were identified as a primary resistance target because of your organic certification and community connections." I felt a chill run through me. So her becoming community relations director, the parking disputes, the harassment, it was all strategic. The position gave her legitimate authority to approach neighboring properties and gather information. The parking issue was a convenient entry point, but the goal was always larger. They need access through your property to develop the Miller and Jacobson farms they've optioned. This revelation explained so much about Diane's persistence and escalation. It wasn't just about parking, it was about creating a legitimate-seeming grievance to justify increasingly aggressive tactics. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, studying Richard's face. "She's your wife." He looked down, shoulders slumping. "I married Diane, believing she shared my vision of country living, appreciation for open spaces, sustainable practices. I've realized our values are fundamentally different. What she did, the forgery, the bulldozing, crossed lines I can't ignore. And there's more." Richard pulled out another document, this one showing financial projections. "They're planning a 500-unit development spanning 300 acres. It would effectively eliminate 4 working farms and redirect the watershed. The environmental impact would be devastating. As someone who'd carefully stewarded my land for sustainability, the scale of this plan was horrifying." "Does her brother know about the criminal charges she's facing?" "He's already engaged high-powered attorneys. Gregory sees this as a temporary setback, nothing more. They've invested too much to back down now." Before I could respond, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face paling. "I need to go. Diane's looking for me, and these documents are technically company property. I've made copies for myself, but you should keep these." As he stood to leave, I asked the question that had been nagging at me. "Why did you buy into Harvest Meadows if you knew it was just phase 1 of a larger development?" He paused. "I didn't know. Not initially. By the time I realized what was happening, we were already established there. Diane managed all our real estate decisions." He looked genuinely regretful. I should have asked more questions. After Richard left, I sat examining the documents, my coffee growing cold. The detailed strategy laid out was both impressive and disturbing, identifying potential allies and obstacles in local government, cataloguing each farm's vulnerabilities, and outlining a multi-year approach to acquiring key properties. I immediately called Ellie, arranging to meet her at her office with the documents. On my way there, I received a text from Deputy Collins. Search warrant executed at Prescott residence. Found red paint matching barn vandalism on shoes in garage. Arrest warrant issued. When I arrived at Ellie's office, she was already on the phone with Ellen Miller from the Agricultural Board. I spread the documents on her conference table as she finished her call. "This changes everything," Ellie said after reviewing the materials. "This isn't just harassment, it's a coordinated corporate strategy using potentially illegal tactics to force land sales. We need to involve the district attorney." "What about the press?" I asked. "People should know what's happening to local farms." Ellie considered this carefully. Prescott Development has the resources to fight back hard, including defamation. Suits if we make claims we can't substantiate. Let's focus on the documented facts, the forgery, the vandalism, the bulldozing incident. I nodded, understanding the need for caution. "So what's our next step?" "Two tracks," Ellie said decisively. "Legally, we provide these documents to law enforcement to strengthen the case against Diane, and potentially expand it to include corporate conspiracy charges if warranted. Publicly, we work with the Agricultural Board to raise awareness about development pressures and the importance of preserving farmland." As we were discussing strategy, Ellie's assistant interrupted with breaking news. Diane Prescott had been arrested at her home on vandalism charges, but her brother Gregory had immediately posted bail. Local news was covering the story, including speculation about connections to Prescott Development Group. "It's starting to unravel for them," Ellie noted. "When legal issues become public, investors get nervous. Development projects like this depend on maintaining positive community perception." I thought about Richard, wondering what consequences he might face for sharing corporate documents. What about Richard? Could he be in trouble for this? Potentially, though whistleblower protections might apply depending on how the DA views the situation. Has he indicated willingness to testify if needed? I'm not sure. He seemed genuinely disturbed by what he'd discovered, but she's still his wife. The battle lines were being redrawn. What had begun as a neighborhood parking dispute had evolved into something much larger, a fight for the future of farming in our community against a powerful corporate developer willing to use underhanded tactics to achieve their goals. The news of Diane's arrest spread quickly through both Harvest Meadows and the surrounding farming community. By evening, local television stations were running segments on the story, complete with helicopter footage of my farm showing the bulldozed section of field. My phone rang constantly. Neighbors, fellow farmers, even local politicians suddenly interested in agricultural preservation. I forwarded most calls to Ellie, who was coordinating our response with the Agricultural Board and county officials. The most surprising call came from Barbara Reynolds. "You need to know what's happening here in Harvest Meadows. Gregory Prescott called an emergency meeting at the community center. He's trying to rally residents against you." "What's his approach?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "He's framing it as defending community interests against obstructionist agricultural practices. He's promising property value increases of 30% if his development plans proceed, and suggesting that supporting his sister is supporting their own financial interests." "How's it being received?" Barbara sighed. "Mixed. Some residents are completely on board, mostly newer arrivals who were drawn by the luxury lifestyle marketing. But others are pushing back hard, especially after learning about the forged documents and vandalism." I thanked her for the information and immediately updated Ellie. She wasn't surprised. "Classic damage control," she noted. He's trying to reframe the narrative from developer using illegal tactics to force land acquisition to community versus unreasonable farmer. We need to get ahead of this. By the next morning, Gregory Prescott had escalated his counterattack. A glossy brochure appeared in every Harvest Meadows mailbox, showcasing beautiful renderings of Harvest Hills Estates, the proposed development that would replace the existing farms. It promised luxury amenities, expanded roads, even a small artificial lake where my irrigation pond currently stood. More concerning was the legal notice delivered to my mailbox. Prescott Development Group was filing a civil suit against me for tortious interference with business expectations and defamation of business reputation. The allegations were vague, but the intent was clear: intimidation. I forwarded this to Ellie, who responded within minutes. Typical slap suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation, designed to drain resources and silence opposition. Don't worry, we'll file for immediate dismissal. Mid-morning, a convoy of 3 black SUVs pulled into my driveway. Gregory Prescott emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by what appeared to be attorneys and public relations staff. Unlike his sister, Gregory had a polished corporate appearance, expensive suit, perfect haircut, practiced smile. Miguel spotted them first and alerted me. I met them at the edge of the farmyard, deliberately choosing not to invite them into my home. Mr. Prescott, this is private property, and I don't recall scheduling a meeting. His smile didn't waver. I thought it was time we spoke directly, farmer to businessman. Clear up these unfortunate misunderstandings. The only misunderstanding was your sister thinking she could forge documents and vandalize my property without consequences. He waved dismissively. Family overzealousness. Diane's passionate about community improvement, sometimes to a fault. But I'm here to discuss the bigger picture, a vision that benefits everyone. He gestured to one of his staff, who opened a sleek presentation portfolio. Inside were the same renderings from the brochure, but with additional details showing projected economic impacts, tax revenue increases, and job creation figures. Harvest Hills Estates represents a $220 million investment in this community, Gregory explained smoothly. Over 300 luxury homes, a boutique commercial district, hiking trails, and dedicated green space. We're not eliminating agriculture. We're evolving it into something more sustainable for modern needs by bulldozing 4 working farms that have fed this community for generations, I challenged, by offering fair market value plus a premium to landowners like yourself who face increasing economic pressures. Farming is noble, but increasingly difficult to sustain financially. We're offering a dignified exit strategy. I studied him carefully. Unlike Diane's emotional outbursts, Gregory's approach was calculating and precise. He'd clearly done this many times before. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, wanting to understand his full strategy. Simple. We withdraw the civil suit. We handle Diane's legal issues discreetly. You receive 150% of assessed property value for your land, plus retained rights to 3 acres surrounding your original farmhouse for personal use. You could even establish a small demonstration garden if the agricultural connection remains important to you. The offer was designed to be tempting, financially generous, while acknowledging my emotional attachment to farming. Many struggling farmers would find it difficult to refuse. And if I decline? His smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. Then, unfortunately, we proceed with litigation. We challenge your permits, your water rights, your organic certification processes. We fund a community action group focused on agricultural impact concerns. We ensure every delivery truck to your farm is scrutinized for weight, emissions, and road impact fees. The threat was clear. Accept our generous offer, or we'll make your life increasingly difficult through 1,000 small cuts. You should know, I responded calmly, that I've forwarded documents detailing your acquisition strategy. including potentially illegal tactics, to both law enforcement and my attorney. For the first time, Gregory's composure slipped slightly. Documents? What documents exactly? The ones outlining Phase 1, community integration and resistance assessment. The targeted property maps. The strategy for creating artificial access disputes. Very comprehensive planning. I was almost impressed. His expression hardened. Those are privileged corporate documents. If someone provided them to you, they've committed corporate espionage. That's a serious crime. So is conspiracy to commit property fraud, vandalism, and filing false reports, I countered. Perhaps we should let the district attorney sort out which is more serious. Gregory's jaw tightened as he studied me with new calculation. The practiced charm had vanished, replaced by cold assessment. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. You may have documents, but we have resources you can't begin to match. This development will proceed, with or without your cooperation. Perhaps. But the path just got a lot more complicated for you, I replied. And expensive. Investors get nervous when developments face criminal investigations and public opposition. He stepped closer, voice lowering. Let me be crystal clear. These farms will be developed. The only question is whether you benefit financially or get crushed in the process. I've been doing this for 20 years. Farmers like you always lose these battles eventually. Then I suppose this will be educational for both of us, I said, maintaining eye contact. After a tense moment, he signaled to his entourage to return to their vehicles. As he turned to leave, he delivered a final warning. This was my professional courtesy call. What follows won't be nearly as pleasant. I watched their vehicles disappear down my driveway, then immediately called Ellie to report the encounter. She listened intently, then responded with unusual urgency. This changes our timetable. If he's making direct threats, he's worried. We need to move faster on multiple fronts. What's our next step? I asked. I'm meeting with the district attorney this afternoon. Gregory's visit constitutes attempted intimidation of a witness in an active criminal investigation. We'll request a restraining order against both Prescotts and potentially seek to freeze certain development activities pending investigation. Within hours, the conflict escalated dramatically. Local news reported that Richard Prescott had filed for emergency separation from Diane, citing discovery of unethical business practices. This legal maneuver effectively protected him from being compelled to testify against his wife while positioning him as a potential cooperating witness in the broader investigation. By evening, Ellie called with another update. The DA is taking this very seriously. They've expanded the investigation to include potential corporate conspiracy charges. Computer forensics teams are examining Prescott Development Group servers under warrant. Meanwhile, Ellen Miller had convened an emergency session of the County Agricultural Board, which voted unanimously to recommend a 6-month moratorium on all agricultural rezoning applications. While not binding, this recommendation carried significant weight with county commissioners. The next morning, I received a surprise visit from Deputy Collins, accompanied by 2 FBI agents in suits. This case has expanded beyond our jurisdiction, he explained after introductions. The potential corporate conspiracy elements, crossing multiple counties and possibly state lines, brought in federal interest. The agents were professional but direct. We're investigating a pattern of potentially fraudulent land acquisition practices by Prescott Development Group across 3 states. Your situation appears to match their typical approach. I invited them into my kitchen, where they spread out files showing similar scenarios. Small farms near growing suburban areas targeted through manufactured disputes, staged environmental concerns, and systematic harassment until owners sold under market value. You're the first case where we have direct documentation of their strategy, one agent explained. Most victims didn't realize they were being targeted as part of a larger scheme until it was too late. As they were leaving, Deputy Collins lingered behind. "Just so you know, surveillance footage from the county building shows Diane accessing the clerk's office after hours through her brother-in-law's security credentials. We've confirmed that's when the document forgery occurred. This new evidence strengthened the criminal case significantly, potentially implicating Judge Prescott in enabling unauthorized access, even if he hadn't known her specific intentions. By mid-afternoon, the story had exploded beyond local news to regional coverage, with headlines highlighting alleged developer conspiracy targeting family farms and criminal investigation into luxury development tactics. Gregory Prescott finally released a public statement. Prescott Development Group categorically denies any improper business practices. While we regret any actions taken independently by Diane Prescott, they do not reflect our corporate policies or strategies. We remain committed to responsible development that benefits communities. The carefully worded statement threw Diane under the bus while attempting to insulate the company from her actions, a strategy that seemed increasingly unlikely to succeed. That evening, several Harvest Meadows residents organized an impromptu gathering at my farm stand. Barbara Reynolds had coordinated a show of support, with over 50 neighbors bringing dishes for a potluck dinner. "We wanted you to know that most of us moved here because we value the agricultural character of this area," Barbara explained. "We don't want to see it paved over for more luxury homes." Lisa Bennett, the environmental science teacher, had brought her entire class to help replant sections of the damaged hayfield as a community service project. "The students are learning about soil remediation and native plants," she explained. "They're also learning about standing up for what's right." As the evening progressed, I found myself surrounded by more allies than I'd realized existed. Even Richard Prescott made a brief appearance, though he remained at the periphery, clearly uncomfortable, but seemingly determined to make his position known. The community response was heartening, but I harbored no illusions that the battle was won. Gregory Prescott hadn't built a development empire by backing down easily, and Diane's personal vendetta had only intensified with her legal troubles. This was merely the end of one phase and the beginning of another, likely more complex confrontation. Ellie called before I'd even finished my morning coffee. "Gregory Prescott has withdrawn the civil suit against you. Apparently, his corporate legal team advised that it would only draw more attention to the criminal investigation." "That's one battle won," I replied. "But I'm guessing he's just changing tactics." "Almost certainly. Corporate developers like Prescott don't abandon projects easily, especially with this much already invested. But for now, we have momentum." That momentum became clearer when County Commissioner Harrington called, requesting a meeting at my farm later that day. As the senior member of the 5-person commission that governed county land use decisions, his interest signaled that the political winds were shifting. Commissioner Harrington arrived promptly at noon, his county SUV kicking up dust on the driveway. A tall, silver-haired man with the weathered face of someone who'd spent time outdoors, he greeted me with a firm handshake. "Quite a situation you've found yourself in," he remarked as we walked the property. "Been on the commission 15 years and never seen anything quite like it." I gave him a tour of the bulldozed area, now partially restored by Lisa's students, and professional remediation efforts. He listened attentively, asking occasional questions about my operation and history with the neighboring subdivision. "The commission is voting tomorrow on that moratorium the Ag Board recommended," he said. Finally. "Wanted to see the situation firsthand before casting my vote." "And your impression?" I asked. He surveyed the farm thoughtfully. "My family farmed for 4 generations before I went into public service. I understand the pressures agricultural operations face today. but I also understand that responsible development is essential for county growth. He turned to face me directly. What concerns me most isn't the development itself, but the tactics. If we allow developers to harass and intimidate property owners, we've failed in our fundamental obligation to protect citizens' rights. This was encouraging, though I remained cautious. The moratorium would only pause rezoning applications, correct? Not prevent them permanently. Correct. 6 months to review our agricultural protection policies and ensure they're adequate. Growth is inevitable, but it should occur through proper channels. Willing sellers, fair market transactions, transparent processes, not forged documents and bulldozers. After Commissioner Harrington left, promising to make calls to his fellow commissioners, I received another visitor, Richard Prescott, looking even more haggard than before. "I've been subpoenaed," he said without preamble. "Federal investigators want all communications between me, Diane, and Gregory regarding Harvest Hills Estate's development." I invited him in, offering coffee, which he accepted gratefully. "Are you going to comply?" I asked. "Already have," he replied. "Turned over everything this morning. Emails, text messages, meeting notes, 3 years of documentation. It's extensive." I studied him carefully, wondering about his motivation. "Why are you telling me this?" He stared into his coffee cup. "Because what they did, what Diane and Gregory planned, it was wrong. Not just illegal, but morally wrong. They used me, used our marriage as part of their strategy. I was just another tool to establish community presence." His voice cracked slightly. "I actually loved living next to farms. I respected what you all do. Meanwhile, my wife was orchestrating a campaign to eliminate everything I valued about moving here." We sat in silence for a moment before he continued. "Gregory called me last night, threatened me, said I'd be named as a co-conspirator if I cooperated with investigators, said they'd ruin me financially." "What did you tell him?" "That it was too late. That I'd already turned over everything." He looked up, a hint of defiance in his eyes. "I'm testifying before the grand jury next week. Richard's cooperation represented a significant crack in the Prescott family's united front. As Ellie later explained, his insider testimony would be particularly valuable for establishing the conspiracy aspects of the case." By evening, the news had broken that Prescott Development Group's offices in 3 states had been searched by federal agents. With computers and documents seized, their stock price dropped 15% before trading was temporarily halted. The next day brought the awaited county commission vote, 4-1, in favor of the 6-month moratorium on agricultural rezoning, with Commissioner Harrington delivering a passionate speech about preserving the county's farming heritage while pursuing balanced growth policies. Meanwhile, Harvest Meadows residents had organized their own response to the unfolding scandal. The HOA voted to terminate their management contract with Prescott Property Management, another subsidiary of Gregory's company, and to pursue legal action against the developer for misrepresentation regarding promised amenities like the community, event space, and adequate parking that had never materialized. The morning news reported that Judge Prescott had taken a voluntary leave of absence pending investigation into whether he had improperly provided courthouse access to his sister-in-law. While he maintained he had no knowledge of her intentions, the appearance of impropriety was sufficient to warrant temporary recusal from his duties. It seemed the Prescott family's carefully constructed influence network was unraveling thread by thread. Yet amid these victories I remained vigilant. Developers with Gregory's resources often had contingency plans, and Diane's personal vendetta had already demonstrated dangerous unpredictability. The moratorium bought time, but it wasn't a permanent solution. My concerns proved warranted when Trevor discovered someone had tampered with the irrigation system overnight, partially damaging a pump and cutting control wires. The sabotage was amateurish, but highlighted our ongoing vulnerability. The irrigation system sabotage prompted immediate security upgrades. I installed motion-activated floodlights throughout the farm and hired overnight security patrols. These were expenses I couldn't really afford, but the alternative, leaving the farm vulnerable, wasn't an option. Deputy Collins examined the damaged equipment, taking samples and photographs. The cuts are clean, made with wire cutters. We'll check for fingerprints, but my guess is they wore gloves. You think it was Diane? I asked. He shrugged. Can't rule it out, though she's under pretty intense scrutiny right now. Could be someone else from the Prescott organization trying to pressure you. That afternoon, Frank Johnson called with troubling news. Just got off the phone with Bob Jacobson. Someone approached his farmhand yesterday, offering cash for information about unsafe practices on the farm. Kid refused, but they left a business card with a number to call if he changed his mind. Let me guess, Prescott Development Group? No visible connection, Frank replied. Company called Agricultural Standards Review Board. Sounds official, but Bob checked. It's a private LLC registered last week, untraceable beyond that. This suggested Gregory was creating shell organizations to continue pressuring farmers while maintaining plausible deniability. I shared this information with Ellie and the FBI agents, who confirmed they'd seen similar tactics in other cases. They're adapting, the lead agent explained, creating distance between official channels and pressure tactics. Classic corporate evasion strategy. The next day, several Harvest Meadows residents reported receiving glossy mailers warning about contaminated groundwater from agricultural runoff and suggesting property values could plummet due to ongoing regulatory investigations of local farms. The materials cited no specific evidence but created an atmosphere of doubt and concern. Barbara Reynolds brought one of the mailers to me. Most people recognize this for what it is, she assured me, but some newer residents are asking questions. They don't have the context to understand this is just another pressure tactic. Together with the Agricultural Board, we organized an emergency community information session. Ellen Miller arranged for county water quality experts to present actual testing data showing no contamination issues from local farms. Local real estate agents provided market analysis demonstrating that properties near preserved agricultural land typically maintained higher values than those in fully developed areas. The session was well attended, with many Harvest Meadows residents asking thoughtful questions. But tension filled the room when Gregory Prescott himself walked in, accompanied by two associates carrying briefcases. He waited until the formal presentations concluded, then approached the microphone during open questions. While I appreciate the presentations tonight, he began smoothly, I must point out that they address current conditions only. Our environmental impact studies project significant changes to groundwater composition if current agricultural practices continue unchecked for another decade. He gestured, and one of his associates distributed folders to county officials present. We've commissioned independent analyses from 3 environmental consulting firms. All reached similar conclusions about long-term impacts of intensive farming on watershed quality. It was a calculated move, shifting the debate from current facts to speculative future scenarios that couldn't be definitively disproven. Several residents looked concerned, exactly as he'd intended. Ellen Miller, however, was prepared. Mr. Prescott, could you clarify which specific intensive farming practices your reports reference? Because the farms in this county are primarily small to medium-scale operations using sustainable methods. Several, including the farm, targeted by your sister's harassment campaign, are certified organic. Gregory's smile tightened. The specific methodologies are detailed in the reports. I'm simply presenting scientific findings for community consideration. Interesting timing, Ellen continued, presenting alarming environmental predictions just as your development plans face increased scrutiny, almost as if you're seeking to devalue the very properties your company has been attempting to acquire. Murmurs spread through the audience as Gregory's strategy became transparent. Before he could respond, Commissioner Harrington stood up. "The county takes environmental concerns seriously," he stated firmly. "We'll review these reports thoroughly. However, I find it curious that they weren't submitted through normal channels to our Environmental Review Board, but rather distributed dramatically at a community meeting." The commissioner's skepticism shifted the room's energy. Gregory attempted to regain control, but the damage was done. What had been designed as a fear-inducing presentation instead reinforced the perception of manipulative tactics. As the meeting concluded, I noticed Richard Prescott had been sitting quietly in the back row, observing his brother-in-law's performance. When Gregory spotted him, their eyes locked in a moment of silent confrontation before Richard deliberately turned away. The next morning brought news that further undermined Gregory's credibility. The independent environmental consulting firms he'd cited were revealed by investigative reporters to have received over 80% of their funding from development interests, including substantial contracts with Prescott Development Group. Meanwhile, federal investigators had expanded their probe, issuing subpoenas to Prescott Development executives and board members. Financial analysts downgraded the company's stock, citing regulatory uncertainties and potential legal liabilities. The momentum seemed to be shifting decisively against the Prescott's plans. Yet amid these developments, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Gregory had invested too much to simply walk away, and Diane's personal animosity remained a volatile factor. My concerns materialized that evening when Trevor called from the eastern fence line. "You better get out here. Someone's bulldozing a path through Harvest Meadows green space, heading straight for our property line." By the time I arrived, I could see heavy equipment cutting through the subdivision's undeveloped buffer zone, creating what appeared to be a rough access road, once again aimed directly at my farm. I immediately called Deputy Collins, while Trevor recorded video of the construction activity. This new incursion was particularly brazen, bulldozing through the subdivision's own protected green space to create an unauthorized access point. Within 20 minutes, Deputy Collins arrived along, with 2 other patrol cars, and surprisingly, Commissioner Harrington, who had apparently been nearby when the call came in. "This is on subdivision property," Deputy Collins confirmed, surveying the scene. "Yes," I explained. "They're cutting through their own green space buffer zone, heading directly toward my property line." Commissioner Harrington looked livid. "That green space is protected under the original development agreement. It's designated conservation land in exchange for higher density housing approval. They can't legally develop it." As law enforcement approached the construction crew, I spotted both Gregory and Diane Prescott standing near the equipment directing operations. When they saw the patrol cars, Gregory stepped forward while Diane retreated toward a black SUV parked on a nearby subdivision street. "Perfect timing," Gregory called with forced confidence. "You can witness the establishment of our legal access route." Deputy Collins was direct. "This activity stops immediately pending verification of permits and authorizations. We have every right to develop subdivision property," Gregory insisted, though I noticed he wasn't presenting any documentation this time. Commissioner Harrington stepped forward. "This specific area is designated conservation land under county agreement. Any modification requires commission approval, which hasn't been requested, let alone granted." Gregory's composure slipped slightly. "We're simply creating emergency access for fire safety, a reasonable modification that doesn't require fire safety access, requires specific design standards and approvals from multiple departments. the commissioner interrupted, none of which have been issued. While this confrontation unfolded, I noticed Diane attempting to slip away to the SUV. Deputy Collins noticed too, dispatching an officer to intercept her. "Ms. Prescott," the officer called, "please remain on scene while we sort this out." Instead of complying, Diane made a dash for the vehicle. The officer caught up just as she reached for the door handle, and what happened next stunned everyone. At present, Diane turned and shoved the officer, screaming, "Get away from me! This is all his fault!" while pointing wildly in my direction. The physical assault on an officer changed the situation immediately. Within moments, Diane was restrained and being read her rights, while Gregory watched in visible shock. "This is a misunderstanding," he attempted, but his usual smooth confidence had evaporated. Commissioner Harrington was already on his phone, summoning county environmental enforcement officers to assess the damage to the protected green space. "Mr. Prescott, your company is now facing significant penalties for unauthorized development of protected land, in addition to whatever charges your sister may incur." As Diane was placed in a patrol car, still shouting accusations, Richard Prescott arrived on scene. He took in the situation with a resigned expression before approaching Gregory. "It's over," I heard him say quietly. "The board is convening an emergency meeting tomorrow. Your major investors are withdrawing support. This," he gestured at the bulldozed green space, "is just the final nail." For the first time, I saw genuine defeat in Gregory's demeanor. The carefully constructed facade of corporate confidence crumbled as he realized how completely his plans had unraveled. The following days brought a cascade of developments. Diane was charged with assault on a law enforcement officer on top of her existing charges. Gregory was removed as CEO of Prescott Development Group by the board of directors, and the company announced it was re-evaluating its expansion strategy in multiple markets. The county commission unanimously extended the agricultural rezoning moratorium to a full year and initiated a comprehensive review of rural preservation policies. Commissioner Harrington personally championed a new agricultural heritage zone designation that would provide tax incentives for maintaining working farms. Harvest Meadows, residents voted to rename their community Orchard View to distance themselves from the Prescott legacy and better reflect their commitment to preserving neighboring farmland. The HOA established a formal collaboration with local farms, including seasonal farm-to-table events and educational programs. 2 months later, as my hayfield regrew and summer crops flourished, Barbara Reynolds brought news that Richard had finalized his divorce from Diane and was selling their Harvest Meadows home. "He's moving to Vermont," she said. "Bought a small apple orchard. Said he finally wants to live the rural life he actually believed in, not just the marketed version." As for Diane, her legal troubles had multiplied. The assault charge was just the beginning. Federal investigators had uncovered her direct involvement in the broader conspiracy, with evidence suggesting she had been a key architect of the aggressive acquisition strategy, rather than merely following her brother's lead. On a warm September evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Frank Johnson's truck pulled into my driveway. He emerged with a 6-pack of local craft beer and joined me on the porch swing. "Quite a summer," he remarked, handing me a bottle. "That's putting it mildly," I agreed. "County called today," he continued. "They're establishing a farmer advisory committee to review development proposals near agricultural operations. Asked if I'd serve. Told them they should ask you instead. I considered this unexpected opportunity. Both of us should serve. Different perspectives." Frank nodded. "Thought you might say that." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching fireflies begin to flicker across the fields. "You know," Frank finally said, "in 40 years of farming I've dealt with drought, floods, market crashes and equipment breakdowns. but I never expected my toughest battle would be with a subdivision Karen who thought my land was her personal. "Parking lot," I laughed, clinking my bottle against his. "Here's to unexpected battles and even more unexpected victories." As darkness settled over the farm, I felt a deep sense of peace. The land remained as it had for generations, productive, respected, and now perhaps more securely protected for the future. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.